So, what truly kills a great civilization? I mean, is it what we always think it is?
Right.
You know, that one big moment, a huge battle, a superior army just smashing through the
The
gates.
external shock.
Exactly. But what if the real killer isn't outside at all? What if it's something, I don't know, slower,
Hmm.
more insidious, something that's already inside the system?
Well, history gives us a pretty sobering answer on that one. We love to remember the dramatic battles, sure, but the sources we're looking at, they consistently show that the real decay, the kind of systemic rot that guarantees a collapse, it happens far, far away from the front lines,
It's happening inside the buildings of government.
deep inside, in the administrative offices, the treasuries, the courts, the constitutional structures of the state itself.
And that is the absolute core of our mission for this deep dive. We are going into a pretty major analysis of institutional collapse and, maybe more importantly, what allows some nations to find an anchor, to hold on through these huge existential crises.
Mm.
Our sources for this are just fascinating, a whole stack of comparative legal and historical research. We're going to look at two massive empires that failed and failed spectacularly: the Mughal Empire in South Asia and then the Qing Dynasty in China.
And then we pivot.
And then we pivot to a modern state that faced its own near-fatal constitutional crisis, but somehow managed to pull back from the brink. We're talking about Pakistan in 2022.
And we're treating these huge historical events, spanning centuries and entire continents, not just as stories. We're looking at them as detailed administrative and legal case studies.
Like a post-mortem.
Exactly. The goal here is to find the what lawyers call the ratio decidendi of national survival.
The reason for the decision, the core legal principle.
The foundational principle that separates a slow 100-year death from the kind of institutional resilience that lets a nation survive.
So the central truth we are trying to unpack is this. A nation's survival, it doesn't depend on how great its past was or how beautiful its buildings are.
Not at all.
It depends entirely on the strength and the functional integrity of its institutions in the here and now. Past glory, it turns out, is a really poor shield against present decay.
And what's so striking when you dig into the material is the universality of the patterns. I mean, we are comparing systems that are worlds apart geographically, philosophically, and yet the symptoms of institutional paralysis that come right before the final collapse, they're nearly identical.
So if we can recognize that blueprint for decay.
Then maybe, just maybe, we can identify the points where you can intervene to stop it.
Okay, so let's start where the research begins, with what some historians call the gold standard of slow collapse. Let's talk about the Mughal Empire.
Right. And to really feel the weight of this failure, you have to first understand the sheer scale, the magnitude of what the Mughal state actually was.
It's staggering.
Absolutely. The Mughal Empire, it ruled the Indian subcontinent for more than 300 years. We're talking from the early 1500s to the mid-1800s. And at its peak, this wasn't just some regional power. It was a global producer of civilization.
Yeah, we all know the architecture, right? The Taj Mahal. But the sources we have, they go so much deeper. They describe this incredible sophistication in their legal codes, their administrative systems, especially how they collected revenue.
And that supported everything else.
Yeah.
A rich tradition of art, literature, and, for a very long time, widespread economic prosperity and just a highly sophisticated administrative order across a massive, diverse territory.
The logistics alone of trying to govern half of South Asia for 3 centuries, I mean, it's just mind-boggling to think about.
And that success, that long run, it really speaks to how powerful their original institutional design was, especially under emperors like Akbar. But here's the deep, almost cynical paradox that the source material keeps coming back to.
What's that?
This huge, sophisticated empire. It didn't die because its enemies suddenly got 10 times stronger. It died because the state itself failed to self-correct. It failed to reform when reform was the only option left.
You draw a contrast in the timeline that really hammers this home. You mentioned the fall of Baghdad. That was a sudden, cataclysmic event. One blow.
A shock to the system.
But the Mughals didn't fall in a day. The sources say they dissolved over 100 years. A century of slow internal decay. What does that long, slow death tell us about how nations collapse?
It tells us that collapse usually isn't an earthquake. It's more like thousands and thousands of termites slowly eating away at the foundations. The institutions were hollowing out long before the British East India Company was even a serious political threat.
So the state was basically committing a kind of slow-motion institutional suicide?
Exactly. The failure was baked in decades, maybe a century, before that final war of independence in 1857.
And the sources, they give us a really detailed roadmap for this internal rot. They lay out 6 key causes or symptoms of this constitutional breakdown. Let's start with the one at the very top. Symptom number 1, weak leadership.
Leadership is the engine. And after the death of the last really strong centralizing emperor, Aurangzeb, in 1707, the emperors who followed were, well, they were increasingly incapable, often just figureheads.
And in an empire that vast, that must have had immediate ripple effects.
Devastating ones.
Yeah.
The entire network of loyalty, of patronage, of revenue collection, which was the literal lifeblood of the empire's finances, it all depended on the centralized strength and authority of the emperor. So when the head gets weak, local commanders, governors, tax officials, they stop fearing Delhi.
And when they stop fearing the center, that leads directly to symptom number 2, doesn't it? The rise of regional powers.
It's the natural next step.
And we're not talking about minor squabbles here. These were major players. The Marathas, the Sikhs, the Rohillas, the Nizams down in Hyderabad, the Nawabs of Bengal. They all started acting like they were independent.
Because for all practical purposes, they were. This is the point where that centralized constitutional structure just, it dissolves. The glue is gone. They stop sending their tax revenue back to Delhi.
So the whole financial system breaks.
The whole system, the Mansabdari system, which tied military rank to land grants for revenue, it completely failed. And then they started raising their own independent armies. And, critically, they started making their own treaties with outside powers, including the new European trading companies.
So legally, the federal structure of the empire was dead, even if the emperor was still the symbolic guy on the throne.
It was a fiction. A useful one for a while, but a fiction nonetheless.
Okay, so the state is losing its money and its military cohesion at the same time. That's a dangerous cocktail. And it mixes right into symptom number 3, widespread corruption. Now, corruption is a word we hear a lot, but the sources here are very specific about where it hit the hardest: revenue collection and the judiciary.
And that's where the social contract is just torn to shreds. With revenue, you had local officials, the subadars and jagirdars, who just started keeping the state's tax money for themselves. They basically became little kings in their own local areas.
So the central treasury is just bleeding out.
It's hemorrhaging money, which means you can't pay the central army, you can't pay your administrators, but, even more lethal than that was the corruption in the judiciary.
Oh, hang on. Explain that. Why is judicial corruption specifically a mechanism for total collapse?
Because a state's entire legitimacy rests on 2 things: its monopoly on violence and its guarantee of justice. When justice is no longer consistent, when you can bribe a judge, when a powerful local official can just ignore a court order from the capital, why would anyone follow the law?
The rule of law just evaporates.
It's gone. If the local taxman is corrupt and the judge is corrupt, why on earth would you pay your taxes or respect the emperor's authority? That loss of moral authority is so much more dangerous than losing one battle.
So the state can't fund itself, it's losing its army, and it's losing its moral right to rule all at once. And that's when symptom 4 just accelerates the whole downward spiral. Military stagnation.
Right. While Europe was going through this period of rapid military innovation, developing volley fire, mobile artillery, professionalized armies, the Mughal forces, they were stuck. They were still relying on 17th century ideas like massed heavy cavalry charges.
Just failed to update their software.
And their hardware. They didn't standardize their equipment, their training was inconsistent, their technology just fell further and further behind. And that makes this vast, rich, but decentralized empire a very tempting target.
Which sets the stage perfectly for symptom number 5, foreign exploitation. This is where the British East India Company comes in, and the sources highlight just how insidious their approach was. They didn't show up with a massive invasion force to conquer the Mughals head-on.
They didn't have to. The company didn't conquer a strong, unified state. It just inserted itself into the institutional cracks we just talked about. It exploited the weaknesses that were already there.
So they played the regional powers against each other.
Precisely. They used their superior military tech against these warring regional rulers, like the Nawabs of Bengal. You really have to look at what happened after the Battle of Buxar in 1764. That was the game changer.
Tell us about that. What was the specific mechanism of exploitation there?
After Buxar, the company secured what were called the Diwani rights for Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. And the Diwani was the right to collect revenue, a right to tax.
Wow.
This one move transformed the East India Company. They stopped being just a foreign company trading spices and textiles. They became the effective tax collector and political ruler of the single richest province in the entire subcontinent.
So they were using Indian money to fund their own expansion.
They used Indian taxes to raise Indian armies, to fight other Indian rulers, and eventually to depose the Mughal emperor himself. It was this slow, almost invisible creep from trade to sovereignty.
And the ultimate failure, the big sickness that allowed all these other symptoms to fester, was number 6, institutional paralysis. The government in Delhi, they must have known things were broken.
Oh, they knew. But they lacked the political will, or maybe just the institutional capacity, to do anything meaningful about it, to implement the necessary reforms in the judiciary, the finances, the military.
Were there any attempts?
Some, yeah, but they were half-hearted, or they were contradictory. And they were always blocked by vested interests, the corrupt nobles, the independent regional kings, the old guard in the military who didn't want to change.
So when you lose that ability to self-correct,
You're just waiting for the end. That ability to look at yourself, see what's broken, and fix it, that's the hallmark of a resilient state. And the Mughals, they'd completely lost it.
this long, agonizing decay finally hits its trigger point in 1857, the Great War of Independence.
Right. It starts as a mutiny among the Indian soldiers, the sepoys, but it quickly swells into this massive popular uprising.
Yeah.
Civilians, local rulers who had been dispossessed, they all joined in. It became a full-scale rebellion against the company's rule.
And the rebels, they needed a symbol, a leader to grant them some legitimacy.
And naturally, they turned to the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, who was basically living under a kind of house arrest in the Red Fort in Delhi.
And his story is just tragic. The sources really highlight his reluctance. He was in his 70s, a great poet, but he had no power. There's that quote from him that just captures the whole thing perfectly.
I am the king of Delhi only in name. Even this title was given to me by strangers.
It's the perfect summary of a state that's become a ghost,
Yeah.
a government that only exists on paper.
Yeah. His leadership of the rebellion was purely symbolic. He was the head of a state with no treasury, no functioning army, no centralized command that could actually fight a modern war. So after the British inevitably crushed the revolt, the end was swift and it was brutal.
What happened?
Zafar was exiled to Burma, his sons were publicly executed, the Mughal state was formally legally abolished, and the British crown stepped in and took direct control of India. The Raj began.
So the Mughal collapse is this ultimate case study. Institutional paralysis, corruption, political infighting, all leading to a slow-motion implosion that let an outside power just walk in and pick up the pieces.
The lesson is just so clear. It's not about the final battle. It's about the century of neglect that made that final battle inevitable.
Okay, now let's pivot. We're going to shift continents, shift cultures, but we're looking for those same shared patterns. Because the story of China's Qing dynasty, it presents this eerily perfect parallel to the Mughal collapse.
It really is almost synchronous. The Qing dynasty was China's last imperial dynasty. They ruled for over 260 years, from the mid-1600s to the early 1900s. And just like the Mughals, they had these long periods of incredible strength, centralization, cultural achievement.
But their collapse in 1911, it mirrored the Mughals not just in how slow it was, but in the actual causes, internal weakness.
Almost identical causes.
Yeah.
You can practically tick off the same list of maladies.
Okay, so let's do it. What were these shared maladies of the king? Was it the same set of symptoms, just in a different cultural context?
Pretty much exactly. First, you have leadership stagnation. The central court in Beijing became paralyzed by infighting between different factions, and it resisted any kind of innovation that might threaten the old order. Tradition became more important than modernization.
And then corruption.
Widespread corruption, absolutely. It metastasized through this vast, sprawling bureaucracy, and it crippled the state's ability to do basic things like manage infrastructure, provide famine relief, or even defend its borders. Just like in Mughal India, the imperial treasury was constantly being drained by corrupt officials.
And all this was happening while the outside world was changing even faster than it did for the Mughals.
Much faster. Which brings us to increased foreign influence. This time it wasn't just one company, it was all the major European powers, and crucially, a rapidly modernizing and very aggressive Japan. And they all saw this systemic weakness in China and began to exploit it.
This was way beyond just trade deals.
Oh yeah, this was enforced through war. The Opium Wars are the most famous example. They led to these humiliating, unequal treaties, foreign control of major port cities, and the carving up of China into these spheres of influence, because the central government was just too weak and its armies were too outdated to stop them.
And that mirrors the Mughal failure to modernize their army. The king had the same problem, right? The profound military failure to modernize.
They tried, in some ways. They invested some money, but it was usually too little, too late, and their strategies were all over the place. The real wake-up call was the Sino-Japanese War in the 1890s.
A humiliating defeat.
A catastrophic defeat. It proved that their partially modernized regional armies were absolutely no match for a unified industrial military power like Japan. And this external weakness, it just made the economic crises worse. They had to pay massive amounts of money to foreign powers, take on crippling loans.
Which then fuels popular anger.
Which leads directly to massive, widespread public rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion, the Boxer Uprising, millions of people died. The country was tearing itself apart from the inside.
And the final, fatal symptom, just like with the Mughals, was that fatal inability to reform. I know the king actually did try to reform a few times. What went wrong?
And that's the key detail, because it actually strengthens the whole argument. Even when they tried, they failed. The early attempts in the 1860s, the Tumsey Restoration, they were too conservative. They were just trying to patch up the old system without fundamentally changing it.
But then there was a more radical attempt, right?
Yeah, it's in 1898, the 100 Days Reforms. The emperor launched this radical top-to-bottom attempt to bring in Western-style institutions, to modernize the entire administration, the military, the education system. It was exactly what was needed.
And it was crushed almost immediately.
Viciously. It was shut down by the conservative Old Guard, led by the powerful Empress Dowager Cixi. The political will just wasn't there. The inertia of the centuries-old bureaucracy was too strong. And that failure, that proved the state had lost its capacity to self-diagnose and perform surgery on itself. Reform delayed had become reform denied.
So the end finally comes with the 1911 Xinhai Revolution. It ends the dynasty, creates the Republic of China, a very quick political change on the surface, but the institutional collapse had been happening for 100 years.
Yes. The revolution just filled the vacuum that the decay had already created.
Okay, let's put these two enormous failures side by side. The source material has a deep comparative table that really helps distill the pure mechanism of decay.
Right. So if you look at structural reform failure, you see the shared DNA of the collapse. The Mughals failed to reform their legal, military, and financial systems. That led to internal fracture and a commercial company taking over.
And
The king failed to reform their administrative and military systems, and that led to external vulnerability and powerful nation-states carving up their territory. The specifics were different, but the core failure was identical.
And the external threats themselves. The scale was different, a company versus nation-states, but the mechanism of exploitation was the same. Weakness invites predation.
It's guarantee. In India, the EIC exploited regional rivalries. In China, foreign powers used military force and economic treaties to exploit a systemic weakness that was obvious to everyone. The weakness was the invitation.
Then there's the internal authority erosion. With the Mughals, local rulers basically became independent kings. With the king, the central government collapsed so completely that you get the rise of these powerful provincial warlords.
Right, who then fought each other for control of China for decades. But in both cases, the central constitutional authority just ceased to be the real source of power on the ground.
And underpinning all of this is the legitimacy crisis. You know, the idea of the mandate of heaven or the sultan's divine right to rule. If that mandate is supposed to provide justice and stability, but the state provides neither,
then the ideology is dead. The people stop believing in the system itself.
And the final triggers. The rebellion of 1857 and the revolution of 1911, they were just the final violent confirmation of a collapse that had already happened internally.
They were the fever breaking after the patient was already gone.
So we have this universal lesson from two of the biggest empires in world history. Reform delayed becomes reform denied and collapse guaranteed. But I want to pause on that for a second. I mean, corruption exists in every system. Polarization happens everywhere. What made the decay in these two empires so lethal when other empires at the time survived?
That is the critical question. And the answer is that the corruption and polarization became lethal because they specifically targeted the mechanism of self-correction. In both cases, the rot was so systemic it paralyzed the three core pillars of the state: revenue, which is funding; the judiciary, which is legitimacy; and the military, which is defense.
And when those three are gone?
There's nothing left. No amount of past glory can save you. And on top of that, the political system lost the consensus it needed to push through painful but necessary reforms. When the choice was radical change or stagnation, the elites chose stagnation. And that is the point of no return.
That is a terrifying insight, and it brings us to our third and, I think, our most vital case study. We're going to shift now from historical collapse to a contemporary near-miss, a moment where the constitutional anchor was tested to its absolute limit and crucially held. We're moving to Pakistan's 2022 constitutional crisis.
And this shift is so important because it lets us see the difference between a failing system and a resilient one in real time. The 2022 vote of no confidence against the prime minister at the time, Imran Khan, was this incredibly intense constitutional crisis that really tested the system to its core.
Yeah, this wasn't just, typical political drama. It raised these deep, fundamental questions, the same kinds of questions that, because they went unanswered for the Mughals and the king, led to their downfall. So what were the specific issues at stake here?
The issues cut right to the heart of what a state is. First, you had the question of parliamentary supremacy and constitutional procedure. Was the no-confidence vote a key feature of the system being handled correctly, or was it being illegally blocked?
And then the foreign interference angle.
Exactly. Deep and very heated debates around foreign interference got completely tangled up with domestic politics. And this raised huge questions about sovereignty and loyalty. But for our analysis, the most important thing it tested was the limits of judicial intervention. Who has the final say when the political branches of government are at war with each other?
Right. The roles of all the key players were just thrown into chaos. The Speaker of the Parliament, the Supreme Court, the loyalty of party members, it all fractured. And it looked, on the surface, a lot like that chaotic factionalism that destroyed the Mughals.
It had all the symptoms of extreme systemic stress. The crisis kicked off when the Speaker of the Parliament tried to just dismiss the no-confidence motion. He cited these vague allegations of foreign interference as the reason.
And then what happened?
Immediately, the Prime Minister advised the President to dissolve the Parliament, and the President did it. So this whole sequence was basically the political executive trying to use procedural tricks to shut down the core mechanism of accountability in a parliamentary democracy.
But this is where the story diverges completely from our historical examples. This is where we see the difference between a failing empire and a resilient modern state. The judicial intervention.
The Supreme Court stepped in,
Hmm.
and they acted swiftly, decisively, and this is so important, unanimously. They acted as the ultimate constitutional anchor, and they restored Parliament.
Hmm.
And their decision wasn't a political one. It was grounded in a very precise reading of the Constitution.
They cited specific articles, right?
Yes, Article 95, which lays out the rules for a no-confidence vote, and Article 69, which is a tricky one. It usually puts a bar on the courts challenging what happens inside Parliament.
Okay, so that's the key legal point. Normally, Article 69 means courts can't interfere with parliamentary business. How did the Supreme Court justify getting involved here?
And that distinction is the institutional genius of the moment. The court knew the stakes were incredibly high. Normally, Article 69 prevents them from intervening in a mere irregularity of procedure. But the court argued that what the Speaker did, throwing out a constitutional motion for reasons not allowed by the Constitution, was not a mere irregularity.
It was a fundamental breach.
It was a fundamental violation of Article 95. It was a constitutional breach that basically negated the entire democratic process.
So the court's logic was, if you just run a session of Parliament badly, we stay out. But if you violate the Constitution itself, we have to step in.
Exactly. They drew a bright, clear, legal line, and their ruling was just definitive. There is no constitutional justification for dissolution. By restoring the vote, the Supreme Court forced all the political actors back into the constitutional arena. It forced them to follow the rules, no matter how hot the political fire was.
So let's look at the parallel danger signs. How close did Pakistan actually come to looking like the early stages of the Mughal or King decline? Because the symptoms were definitely there.
They were terrifyingly present. You saw a huge increase in internal political divisions and polarization. It made normal governance almost impossible, a direct echo of the factionalism that paralyzed Delhi and Beijing.
And institutions were fighting each other.
You had core institutions taking conflicting positions, the Speaker and the President on one side, Parliament, and the opposition on the other. The meaning of the Constitution became highly contested, which made the public lose trust in the law itself.
And the geopolitical angle, the foreign interference claims, just threw gasoline on the fire.
It absolutely did. And it mirrors how foreign powers were able to exploit the internal divisions in the old empires. All of this led to a moment where the stability of the state felt genuinely uncertain. But here's the survival insight.
This is the key difference.
This is the key. Pakistan survived this crisis only because the Constitution acted as an anchor. The institution of the Supreme Court, interpreting that supreme law with clarity and unity, it functioned, it worked, right at the moment of maximum stress.
So the Mughals and king collapsed because their constitutional anchors were either too rotten to work or they were just ignored by powerful players. But Pakistan in 2022 showed that even with all the same symptoms, polarization, factionalism, a strong, decisive judiciary that sticks to the rule of law, can step in and pull the whole system back from the brink.
It proves the argument. A functional institution is the only real prophylactic against national collapse.
Okay, let's move into our final section, the crucial step. We need to bring all three of these cases back together now and draw some definitive comparative conclusions. We've seen how states decay, and we've seen how one was prevented from decaying.
And now we can get really specific about the differences. Let's start with head of state weakness. In the Mughal Empire, the head of state was purely symbolic, completely powerless like Zafar. In the king, the emperor was weak, controlled by the bureaucracy and court insiders like Xinhai.
But in Pakistan,
You had a prime minister and a parliament at war with each other, and a president who intervened. The key is, while their roles were contested, they were still defined by the Constitution. That gave the judiciary a legal framework to interpret and restore order.
so the fight was happening within the framework, whereas with the Mughals and king, the fight destroyed the framework itself.
That's it, perfectly. Now look at central authority versus factions. The Mughals had internal factions, the Nawabs and Marathas, that just overpowered the center. The king had provincial warlords who carved up the country. But Pakistan had deeply polarized political parties.
Which is chaotic, but different from warlords.
It's very different, because as destructive as that polarization was, it was still ultimately bound by the existence of a higher authority, the Supreme Court. The warlords never appeared, because the legal system still had precedence over armed conflict.
I think the most important comparison, though, is reform timing.
Without a doubt. For the Mughals and the king, there was effectively no meaningful institutional reform in time. The 100 Days reforms were crushed, other attempts were too little, too late. But in Pakistan, the crisis itself, even after it was resolved, it generated these intense, immediate demands for electoral and institutional reform.
So the system, even under stress, still had the ability to diagnose itself.
It still had the capacity for self-diagnosis and, crucially, the political space to debate how to fix itself without collapsing into chaos.
And finally, the role of external influence. For the Mughals and king, foreign actors were actively exploiting a weakness that was obvious to everyone. The EIC took the Diwani. Western powers carved out territory.
But in Pakistan, even with all the intense allegations of foreign involvement, the core institutional anchor, the Supreme Court, refused to let those allegations override constitutional procedure. Their legal action insulated the democratic process from the political narrative, and it forced a domestic legal resolution.
Which brings us to the ultimate comparison, the outcome. For the Mughals and king, it was irreversible collapse. The dynasties ended, the political structures were abolished, the state was either broken up or taken over. But for Pakistan,
Constitutional collapse was prevented.
yes,
Decisively. The crisis was resolved through the law, which forced the politicians to finish the process inside the established framework. The integrity of the institution was protected.
So after all that, we arrive at the ratio decidendi, the ultimate legal and historical principle we can pull from this huge cross-cultural comparison.
Yes.
Lay it out for us. What is it?
The principle is definitive, and I think it applies to every single state, regardless of its history or ideology.
Yeah.
It is this. A state must reform before it breaks. Delay in reform is the first stage of national collapse.
That's not just historical advice. That's a prescription.
It's a mandate for survival. If you wait until your institutions are completely polarized, financially broke, riddled with corruption, or being bypassed by the executive branch, then the internal mechanism for correction is already too weak to save you. A state's immune system is its ability to perform painful, necessary, and timely self-surgery.
And the impact of these events, it just echoes through history. The Mughal collapse reshaped South Asia for 200 years. It led directly to the British Raj and the incredibly complex legacy of partition.
And the Qing collapse reshaped all of East Asia. It led to decades of civil war, foreign invasion, and ultimately the rise of modern China. These were events that fundamentally changed the world order.
And even the 2022 crisis in Pakistan, though it was resolved, it reshaped their constitutional law. It set this clear, unanimous precedent that the judiciary will step in when political actors try to get around fundamental constitutional rules. And that precedent is itself an institutional upgrade. It's a legal fortification against the next crisis.
Institutional strength isn't about your glorious past. It's about present functionality, about adhering to the rules and having the courage to enforce the law when it's politically difficult.
This has been a really profound deep dive, moving from the total collapse of two of the world's greatest empires to the knife-edge resilience of a modern constitutional state. Let's try to wrap up with a moral lesson here.
I think the moral lesson is a humbling one. Civilizations die slowly, and often they die ignobly. It's rarely in some grand, heroic final battle. They die from sustained neglect, from deep internal division, from paralyzing corruption, and most critically, from a systemic refusal by the people in charge to evolve, to update their own operating systems.
So the takeaway for you, the listener, is that our ability to recognize these slow, insidious signs of decay, it's critical. The intense polarization, the constant drumbeat of corruption allegations against the courts or the tax system, the institutional paralysis where every attempt at reform gets crushed. These aren't just minor political problems.
They're the historical symptoms of state failure.
Yeah, right. It's not the external threat that guarantees collapse. It's the internal rot. The inability of the system to fix itself is what seals a nation's fate.
The difference between 100 years of decay and a crisis resolved in a week by a court ruling was the functional anchor of the law.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to think about. If the constitutional anchors, the judiciary, the rule of law, the adherence to procedure, if they fail, as they did in 1857 and 1911, what's left? What is the next layer of resilience a society can possibly rely on? Or is timely, difficult, often unpopular institutional reform really the only thing that can prevent a national collapse? When you look at the symptoms we talked about today, weak leadership, polarization, corruption, stagnation, what institutional reforms would you prioritize in your own society, knowing what history tells us about the price of delay?
We've laid out the historical warnings and the modern precedent for survival. The challenge of what to build and what to maintain is now yours.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.